while we're waiting for Adam back and Harry Halpin to come to the stage, I'm going to tell y'all about the Bitcoin 2022 conference. So Bitcoin 2022, April 6th through the 9th in Miami, Florida. It is a festival celebrating the Bitcoin culture, 4 days of straight, nonstop Bitcoining. Wednesday is our industry day. That is a full day dedicated to those building Bitcoin, the industry, the open source developers, the miners. So that is the industry day. Thursday, Friday, that is the full 2 days of Bitcoin 2022 general admission madness. That is thousands of people descending on Miami Beach, Florida for Bitcoin, hundreds and hundreds of speakers on 4 stages. And then Saturday, the 9th, is Sound Money Fest. So that is a 1-day music festival dedicated to the Bitcoin culture. All of the hundreds of Bitcoin artists at our art gallery will be in display all 4 days, including Sound Money Fest. And we have incredible headliners getting on stage to perform for Bitcoiners at Sound Money Fest. And for those who are not into the lineup, there's going to be quite an incredible lineup of comedians. Last year we had Tim Dillon, which was awesome, and we want to do that 5-6 times better. So take a look at b.tc/conference. Check out the promo code Satoshi. So that is promo code Satoshi for 10% off. And don't miss the conference. Harry, welcome to the stage. How's it going, my man?
Excellent, excellent. So this is going to be a sort of kind of old school session, let's say. I'm a former research scientist at MIT and a kind of a PhD in AI sort of guy. That's my background. I run a Mixnet company called NIM Technologies, and I'm very interested in the history of proof of work and mixnets. And so I'm incredibly excited to be discussing with Adam back the kind of how proof of work came to be in this whole sort of culture of anonymous email remailers that the cypherpunks created, things that sort of led to sort of the prehistory of Bitcoin. So that's I hope people are interested in this topic. I think it should be pretty crazy. A lot of things which at least I've been looking at this topic for years, and a lot of the most important stuff hasn't been written down. So it's all this kind of oral cypherpunk history.
Yeah, I'm excited to dive in, Harry. I know you have a lot of questions for Dr. Adam back when he joins, and it looks like he's in the audience now. But while we're waiting for Adam to join, can you, can you talk a little bit about Nimtech and, generally what you're trying to
Yeah,
do?
I'll give a quick overview of something a lot of people don't think about, which is the peer-to-peer broadcast in Bitcoin. So whenever I do a Bitcoin transaction, or I'm a miner, I want to broadcast my mining block, or I want to just send a transaction through a full node. There's a peer-to-peer broadcast over TCP/IP, and I think a lot of people have slowly figured out over time that broadcast reveals my IP address, which if you're using IPv4, looks like something like 254.168.8.30 or something. If you're using IPv6, it's an incomprehensible list of letters and numbers. But regardless, that IP address, you can go to a website like whatismyipaddress.com, I think, and it will track that IP address down to the neighborhood that you're in. And that, if you're trying to use Bitcoin in a pseudonymous fashion, that's pretty dangerous. Now, luckily, the Bitcoin devs are incredibly intelligent and have recognized this. And so you have new technologies implemented in Bitcoin. Actually, I think 2 or 3 years ago, Dandelion, which tries to basically, rather than just your full node doing that broadcast directly, you do Dandelion looks like a flower, right? So you do 1 or 2 or 3 randomized hops. That's the stem, and then you do the broadcast. That's like the petals and the flower being opened. But the problem is that if you're really concerned about your Bitcoin transaction, if you're really concerned about your privacy, you also have to be concerned about more powerful adversaries, tech companies like Chainalysis, for example, which in 2015 were revealed to be running lots of full nodes and doing lots of connections to other full nodes, trying to making themselves a sort of super node in order to figure out people's IP addresses. And then you have to not only worry about IP addresses, but if you can imagine a very powerful adversary, sort of, with a god's eye view of the network, like the NSA, this is what you call an global passive adversary. They don't, even if you try to hide your IP address using Dandelion or using a VPN or using Tor, they can look at the traffic patterns. They can look at the timing and volume of when you've sent those transactions, how often you sent them. Let's say I did 2 or 3 transactions at once, and they can use that to kind of track you down. And that's pretty dangerous. And so we have been looking at trying to solve this. I mean, Lightning is nice insofar as that's off chain, but we have some unpublished R&D and a little bit of published R&D with my fellow NIM employee Anya Petrovska showing that these kinds of powerful adversaries, even if you're doing your transactions off chain using Lightning, they can still look at who's sending who packets and figure out who they are. And even with technology like VPNs and Tor, these adversaries can kind of look at the entry nodes of Tor and look at the exit nodes and do kind of what's called traffic correlation attacks. And those are sort of probably some of the kinds of attacks that have helped bring down, things that maybe some of us don't agree with, like dark markets, but also can be used to de-anonymize and block and censor perfectly, maybe not censor, but they can at least be used to de-anonymize connections. So peer-to-peer broadcasts are great because they're censorship resistant, but they're not so great because they're not very privacy preserving. And so there's this whole other stack of technologies developed, invented by David Chaum, and then developed, numerous people, and the Cypherpunk mailing list developed them. Len Sassaman, Lance Cottrell with the Mixmaster system, then Mixminion with the George Denises, the Tor developers, and now me and George back together again working on NIM, which is called a Mixnet. And the concept of a Mixnet is different than Tor and Dandelion insofar as that it adds a new element to defend against these kind of global passive adversaries. So not only does it kind of encrypt your packets and send them to different computers like Dandelion or Tor, it also mixes up the packets. That's why it's called a Mixnet. It takes the packets, and if you consider the packets to be like cards, it's similar to a deck of cards. It just shuffles those cards and sends it to another node. That node does a shuffle. And what NIM does, which is a little bit different than the older networks, is we kind of use a kind of nice statistical process and we add fake traffic in to try to do essentially some form of what Adam called traffic shaping, which we think, and we are still working on improving this, provides provably better anonymous peer-to-peer broadcast for Bitcoin than say Dandelion or Tor, but also more importantly can be used not just for Bitcoin but for other kinds of traffic as well. Just as you can use a VPN with Bitcoin or Tor with Bitcoin, but you can also use Tor to browse the web or VPN even to browse the web. So that's kind of what we're interested in, and that's why I'm happy to answer and discuss this topic in length. But I'm particularly interested in the kind of history of how mixnets, which were used to defend email, to keep email anonymous, particularly from adversaries. I think the Scientologists were the first back in the 90s, and how this led to technologies that I think most people don't know Adam helped invent or helped work on. So everyone knows Adam Back from inventing proof of work, but very few people know the story about how proof of work comes out of all this other amazing work that Adam and Adam Shostak and a bunch of Ian Goldberg and a bunch of other amazing cypherpunks were doing on what was called the Freedom Network, and other alternative networks such as PipeNet by Wei Dai, which I think most people have forgotten, which are super interesting because it shows that the space of anonymous networking technologies is not just limited to VPNs or Tor, that there's a huge space of technologies that hasn't been fully explored that we think could help us defend our privacy against even these kind of nation state level adversaries. So that's a pretty long introduction. Sorry about that. But that is indeed the kind of short overview of what we call these mixnets or anonymous overlay networks like onion routing.
Curiously, I was running a Mixmaster remailer is how I came to invent HashCash because So what Harry said, like one form of quite good privacy is Mixmaster, which is for anonymizing emails. It splits them into fixed size packets, sends them around to remailers, and the remailers reorder packets. And so it's harder to like passively observe and imply from the message send time who's sending what. Whereas more real-time systems, which are used for web browsing like Tor, are easier to track because there's essentially no reordering. And reordering adds latency. Email is a kind of store and forward thing which can tolerate, 15 minutes of message delivery latency. Nobody wants that for browsing the web. And so browsing the web is much harder to provide privacy for. So how HashCash came out of that situation was I was operating one of these remailers. It was called Swiss.ch. So I had rented a shell account from a friend of mine who lived in Switzerland and had a small one-man ISP as a kind of hobby beside his day job. So there's a bit of jurisdictional arbitrage going on there, which is a kind of fun story in itself. And but people were basically spamming through the remailers, and it wasn't like commercial spam, like trying to make money. It was like a denial of service. They were just sending random numbers and being a nuisance and sending it to Usenet discussion forums, so it would get broadcast around the world 1,000 times over across thousands of Usenet servers. And we think what they were trying to do is they didn't like privacy, so they wanted to annoy or trigger the system administrators that operated these Usenet services to block remailers. So they would like create a nuisance through the remailers. So it's kind of false flag operation. And so sort of looking at that and trying to think about what one could do about that, let me think about spam in a different way, which is most of the spam technology, even today, is actually trying to identify the sender and blacklist them. And in this environment, with remailers, you can't blacklist an IP address or a sending email because you don't know what it is by design, right? And so that led to the alternative viewpoint. Well, like the actual problem is that email is free, and if we can impose a small cost, that would deter this kind of behavior or make it expensive. And so that's where the HashCash postage stamp came from.
So I've got a quick question for you, Adam. So that's fascinating because I had always sort of guessed that maybe the anonymous email spam issue was due to Mixmaster. So it's wonderful to know you were actually running Lynn and Lance's Mixmaster software. I didn't know you actually were suffering denial of service attacks. So that's crazy. I don't know why these people were against privacy, but who knows? I mean, all sorts of attacks can happen. What can you explain a little bit about what happened after Mixmaster? Because this is where I have real trouble, and I consider myself a kind of expert in this space, figuring out what's going on. Because there's all this really interesting discussions with Cypherpunk mailing lists, and your initial paper on mass surveillance with zero knowledge systems, where you point out that there's a sort of trade-off function. And I think you and your co-authors were the first people to point this out. It's now formalized something called the Anonymity Trilemma, where there's a trade-off between latency, anonymity, and bandwidth. And you also point out DDoS attacks, which no one really talks about anymore, which are still a giant deal, right? And the whole internet's behind Cloudflare because of this DDoS nonsense. So I'd like to hear like what happened after Mixmaster with PipeNet and Freedom. I don't know if did anyone implement PipeNet. I mean, there's these questions I've never been able to quite figure out.
Yeah, so PipeNet never got implemented. I think our paper probably was the first to point out that trilemma, though we didn't express it in exactly the same terms. And one of the trilemma is that this kind of the PipeNet type of design is quite good for privacy, but it's vulnerable to denial of service because to stop the whole network, you can just make a route through it and not send any traffic, because the PipeNet model is that every node connected to a node has to send its message in a kind of interval, and then those are shuffled and sent out again. And so if any of them don't send, the network stops and that flows through the system. So that's not good. And then the other observation is that the real-time networks are quite vulnerable to passive adversaries because people want low latency. And I think if you talk about a passive adversary, there's a weaker attacker, which is a kind of a participant that selectively jams channel capacity. So you'll be able to discover what the channel capacity is by just repeatedly opening circuits until you get declined, and then you know the capacity. And so you can kind of send a lot of bandwidth and interfere with other people. And if you if you can see on a web server somebody's browsing something, you can just jam different circuits through the network and see when their web browsing stops or becomes slow. And now you know who's doing it. So the usual threat model is to not consider that. They'll talk about a global passive adversary and they'll think that that's unlikely or expensive or outside their threat model. I mean, of course, the Snowden disclosures came after this and showed that actually that was perfectly plausible. In any case, you can attack it without being a global passive adversary by being a malicious user, basically, and selectively denying service and watching what happens while only having visibility on a few places. Yeah, so those are the kind of trade-offs. And I guess, the Lightning Network also has a kind of fairly real-time sort of Tor-like protocol in it. And then there's Tor and the NIMIP project, so which brings some more modern crypto to the story.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm very interested. I mean, I think so. For those of you that haven't read Adam's paper, let's see, I can bring up the title. It's called "Traffic Analysis Attacks and Trade-offs in Anonymity Providing Systems" by Adam Olfmuller and Anton Stiglick, who are all. This is all pre-Blockstream. So this is Zero Knowledge Systems Incorporated. And that is a quite, even though most people don't know about these systems, this sort of was I think maybe about the first paper that says, well, look, everyone's really worried about cryptography. In fact, if you don't mind, Adam, I can even quote the paper because I think it's got a really good quote in it where we basically point out that, let's see if I can find the exact sentence. Cryptographers have studied ways of providing confidentiality, authentication, and integrity to parties that wish to communicate securely amongst each other. Protocols that provide these properties have been thoroughly studied, and we now have efficient, effective, and reasonably well understood protocols. So this is, just on the side, TLS, PGP, so on and so forth. One other desired property has received much less attention is that of protecting the identity of one partners in communication. This is an important property. For example, the mere fact that two competing companies are exchanging messages might leak valuable information. For example, it could be an indication that two companies are negotiating a merger. And it's also a property desired by internet users. Users don't want to be monitored to have their surfing habits logged and preserved by unauthorized parties in order to create a dossier that contains extensive information about them and stored for long periods of time. So I think that's a great problem statement because I think a lot of people get a little bit confused, and I think reasonably so, between the kind of what we call security properties, the protecting the content of the message itself. That's what cryptography does. And what privacy systems are trying to achieve, which is a bit broader, particularly with anonymous traffic overlay networks. We're trying to actually defend the metadata. Who is sending who? Is Alice talking to Bob? Is someone sending Bitcoin to someone else? And, and I think a lot of people just kind of view Tor as a black box that just kind of solves this problem magically, or maybe they don't know about Tor. They view their VPN as a black box that stores this problem magically, or maybe they view, if they know a lot about Bitcoin, they might think Dandelion is a black box that solves this problem. But the fact of the matter is, it's actually a very hard problem to solve, and there's lots of trade-offs, and there's lots of very clever attacks, some of which we don't really have good solutions to. So there's one attack, which you mentioned, which is something that we're dealing with right now at NIM, or at least we're trying to deal with it. We haven't got it completely solved, is something that you call the latency attack. And you note that the latency attack is the most difficult to protect against. So I think this is the attack that, so let's say I want to figure out if two people are communicating to each other, or they're using the same circuit, or the same lightning channel. So I can just sort of ping, if I can not just clog the traffic, but I can just ping the nodes that I think are involved, and I can figure out how far away they are from each other, because the speed of light, it's fast, but it's not that fast. We can still get differences between pinging a server in Japan and a server in the United States or a server in Europe. And these kind of attacks can let you statistically figure out who's using what anonymous channel or not. So I don't know if you do you have any feel. I mean, I assume this is also something people can use and take advantage of with Bitcoin as well. I don't know what do you think of this kind of these sort of latency attacks as well? And this is kind of again outside the scope of traditional cryptography, but very much just like DDoS attacks are really real world attack that if you really want to use the internet effectively and anonymously, you have to think about. I will just say it's a very hard problem. At NIM, we're trying to do something which sounds a bit crazy, but what I do think is the right way to solve the problem, which we just admitted exists, that there are going to be different latencies between different nodes and networks. So if I'm trying to figure out if you're using Lightning or if you're using Tor, and I'm going to figure out what Tor node you are, and I'm trying to guess which geographical location you are. These latencies can be used to de-anonymize you, but what we are hoping to do is by basically, again, it's a trade-off. By making the traffic a little bit slower, we think we can disguise these latencies, and by also ordering the kind of routes so that the routes go through a uniform set of latencies. So let's say in Tor, most of the traffic is from the United States because most people that use Tor are in the United States for some reason. It goes to Germany because there's lots of volunteers in Germany running Tor nodes. And then it goes back to the United States because most people that use Tor, they're accessing some Silicon Valley service. But you can imagine more sophisticated systems which enforce some kind of latency ordering. So for example, let's imagine, Tor, it's a little bit like a VPN, but there's 3 hops. So I send traffic from one hop to another hop to a third hop. What if that first hop was always in Europe? What if that second hop was always in Asia? And what if that third hop was always in the Americas? And we could sort of prove that these IP addresses were in these locations. I think that might be one way to attack that problem. But that being said, just fair warning, we at NIM are still working on this. Tor hasn't solved this problem, and no other technology, to my knowledge, has. I don't know, Adam, do you have any thoughts on these kind of latency issues and all of this?
Yeah, I mean it's a problem because one threat model is the global passive adversary, but there's a simpler, cheaper threat model, which people are assuming is intelligence agencies basically. But there's a cheaper attack, which is that you can potentially influence latency by getting a high speed server in Amazon or something and flooding different channels in the network and seeing who slows down as a result, right? So you can sort of use a binary search to triangulate something. If you've got visibility of a website where there's some traffic and you have visibility of some candidate users, you only need it's kind of black box, right? You can sort of find out and narrow things down step by step, binary search. So it's tricky. And of course, the approaches that do more like PipeNet or Mixnet did avoid that because they insist on getting traffic from all of the nodes and reordering them or placing a minimum. They might let the traffic through after a certain delay. But of course, that has side effects for interactive browsing. So one thing I thought about, which I'm not sure has been done, is actually to include the web servers inside the anonymity network itself. So basically to make Apache web server and common web server plugins that terminate Tor or NIM-IP, right in the web server, so that for the outside observer, they can't tell as easily what's going on with the web traffic because some of the web traffic is unencrypted, or the sizes of the web requests make it obvious which page is being requested because the traffic going to the website is kind of visible through SSL, like the shape of it, which page has been loaded, probably. So some of that could be combated by bringing the web server into the model, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the nice things about Bitcoin is the transactions are fairly uniform size, and people forget when they're using Tor to go to like a website and someone to buy something. That website has a fingerprint. It's literally, you can do what's called a website fingerprinting attack, and that exactly is the shape of the website. And what is the shape of the website? That's the number of TCP/IP packets that need to download all that wonderful HTML and JavaScript, and that's pretty unique. That's pretty unique per website. So, obviously, just to repeat, I can just look at which website you're going to. If I'm your ISP, if I guess you're going to, let's say, I don't know, www.evilweb.com, and evilweb.com has a certain amount of JavaScript and certain HTML that has a certain size. I can kind of figure out by just looking, literally a very weak adversary, just your ISP can kind of figure out you're looking evilweb.com, even if you're just downloading packets over Tor or VPN. And I think what Adam was pointing to there is sort of what Tor is trying to do with hidden services, where hidden services put a website or another kind of service inside of Tor. So I'm going through Tor, I'm hopping through Tor, but rather than exit Tor, I essentially have a kind of DHT, a distributed hash table in the middle, and that DHT redirects me to a particular Tor, a kind of hidden service inside of Tor, which then could be a website that's only accessible via its .onion address using only the Tor browser. And that is pretty cool. And that's obviously what a lot of people have been working on. Now, what we've noticed, though, over time is that those hidden services, those kind of websites inside Tor, are also getting taken out on a regular basis. We suspect that it's a sort of similar kind of attack to what you do to the endpoints. You can also do inside Tor. So you can say, well, I believe that this node inside Tor is hosting, www, I don't know, Silk Road version 5.org. And, I know what Silk Road version 5.org, what its fingerprint is in terms of JavaScript and HTML. So I'm just going to watch all the traffic going around Tor and try to kind of guess which nodes are hosting that website. And I think that's what some of the scandals around Carnegie Mellon and Tor were about, where the researchers from Carnegie Mellon were essentially attacking Tor, trying to figure these things out, I think, on behalf of the U.S. government. Then, of course, we have all the end-to-end correlation attacks on Tor, which Adam also mentioned, where, TLS used to be stripped off and people would just steal Bitcoin, and now I forget what's called, the Keck or CAC attack, where a bunch of Tor exit nodes are ran by adversaries. These are really hard attacks to prevent. At NIM, we are kind of moving away from a Tor-like model because the thing is, we're more like PipeNet or a Mixnet. And because of that, we're naturally going to be a bit slower because we're mixing these packets up and we're routing each packet individually. So, and the way to think about individual packet routing is that every time I send a new packet, it gets a new route. And this is not what Tor VPNs do. When I use a VPN, I just use one route. It's always the same VPN. And Tor is much better. It's a 3-hop route, but the problem is that route changes only every 10 minutes. So the nice thing about Dandelion is that the route is randomized with every Bitcoin transaction. So that's one point where Dandelion is superior, I would say, to just a kind of naive usage of Tor in a full node with Bitcoin. But at the same point, if you're routing each message individually because you're really paranoid, you're going to have a certain slowdown. And I think that slowdown might be okay. And the way we're trying to tackle that slowdown at NIM, that latency trade-off, we're more anonymous but willing to be a bit slower, is that we basically sort of say, well, there's certain kinds of transactions people are okay with being a few seconds or maybe even a few minutes slow, such as email, such as Bitcoin transactions. And a lot of these transactions are not web browsing. And while web browsing needs a kind of open internet proxy, or it needs the ability to host websites, most of what people are doing with Bitcoin or with instant messaging is either like a client-server model. So Signal has essentially a server, and you have a Signal client on your phone. Or in Bitcoin, you have a full node that does the broadcast, and you have often most people aren't running their own full nodes. You have a light client, SPV wallet or whatever, that you're using for your initial that communicates to the full node. So we at NIM are kind of looking at really working at disguising that initial connection from the client to the server so that the server doesn't know who you are, or in this case, the Bitcoin full node you're fully unlinked from the Bitcoin full node. So that's kind of what we're concentrating on, and that's more of a client server model inside, weirdly enough, using a peer-to-peer network to defend and keep anonymous the connection between the client and the server so that the server can then talk to, for example, another peer-to-peer network. And this all sounds a bit paranoid, but I do want to just point out to people these attacks are pretty realistic. We have evidence. There was a big scandal in 2015. I'd love to know if Adam knows about this or other people know about, where Chainalysis did get revealed that they were running a lot of Bitcoin full nodes. And people, I think they were just literally singing pings over the Bitcoin network, and they were discovering that some of these nodes were ran by Chainalysis. I think they had some sort of Chainalysis login. And then more recently, well, we said, well, this is, of course, if this is happening, how bad is how many nodes have to be corrupt so you can de-anonymize people using their IP address? And so we did some new research, and I'll try to put this on the internet afterwards and share the link, where we looked at the Lightning Network, and we said that, looking at the real world Lightning Network today, you can, if there's kind of 5 adversarial nodes, if you want to do a de-anonymization attacks on Lightning Network transactions, you can de-anonymize about half of the transactions. And Dandelion and Dandelion Plus, again, much better than nothing, but they really only provide 2 bits or maybe 5 bits of entropy, which is not very much. That's, for you're anonymous among 4 people, for example, 2 bits of entropy, when only 15% of the network is the Bitcoin full nodes are corrupt. So I would like to know, I mean, Adam, do you think these attacks are realistic on Bitcoin, or you at Blockstream see a lot more Bitcoin than we do? How do you think there are these attacks that de-anonymize Bitcoin users on a regular basis, and what should we do about it?
Using Bitcoin, Bitcoin transactions are small, so they can afford, and they're not that real time, right? Because you've got to wait for a block to confirm them anyway. So I think, tens of seconds of latency on a Bitcoin transaction are fine. So it seems to me like a kind of moderately slow, shuffled broadcast with layered encryption would be pretty good for Bitcoin transactions, as a complement to Dandelion, which is just trying to make it less obvious which IP address is the sender's, and to do encryption on the hops.
Yo, what is going on, plebs? We're going to take a break from our programming to tell you about the resurrection of our print magazine, starting with the El Salvador issue. Starting this fall, Bitcoin Magazine will be available on newsstands nationwide and at retail stores such as Barnes and Noble. Don't want to get off your couch, though? No problem. You can also go to store.bitcoinmagazine.com. So skip the line and get each issue shipped directly to your front door with our annual subscription. I'm talking 4 issues a year that contain exclusive interviews and profiles with leading Bitcoiners, actionable insights on the state of the market, breaking news and cultural trends, along with powerful photos and artwork from the best artists in the world. Subscribe today and get 21% off using code podcast at checkout. That's PODCAST, podcast at checkout.
And then another interesting bit of cypherpunk history, which I think has been a little bit forgotten, which I would like, because I was trying to understand this as well. So before, so I do think that it's realistic to use, something like a Mixnet to defend at least the first hop to a full node, and using that in conjunction with Dandelion should provide, I think, some pretty stellar privacy. That's why we're trying to build NIM. Until we have NIM working, I would just suggest people use Tor. Tor is Tor is all open source. The developers are pretty hardcore, amazing people. So I do want to make sure we keep supporting the Tor community. Back in the day, there were some alternatives to Tor, and one of the most interesting, I can never quite figure out the exact design or how it differed from Tor, was the network that you were working on, or at least for some part of your life, Adam, called Freedom. Can you describe technically what the kind of concept of the Freedom Network was? This is, again, I think, pre-Bitcoin, and how the Freedom Network differed or didn't differ from Tor?
Yeah, it just came before Tor, and it's like kind of Tor-like. And of course, it was targeting real-time use, like web browsing. The way it was organized was Zero Knowledge Systems was a business, so they were trying to make money so they could build more privacy tech. And so they were charging for kind of network access, and then providing a revenue share to ISPs internationally that were sympathetic to privacy to run a rack mount server running this software. And then those kind of servers would form the backbone of the network. So I think Tor is a little bit, more peer-to-peer, decentralized. Anybody can join and run a Tor node, whereas the Freedom Network was less peer-to-peer. And I guess it's like a little easier to start that way. And then another thing we did at Zero was we had a slower kind of network for email, and that was, a bit more Mixmaster-like and was actually replyable because Mixmaster by itself, you can't reply to the email, and there's a concept of a sort of pseudonymous email that is replyable with a kind of reply block or something. So we had a system for that at Zero, and at some point I was thinking that actually this may not be that good in privacy and security terms, so that maybe we should, because one of the challenges with that is if you can reply, there is a publicly accessible blob which is a nested encrypted instruction of how to identify you, like how to find your real unencrypted email address. It's just like your email address encrypted through like 3 or 5 servers, and you'll discover the identity of each server as you decrypt it. And so there was a real risk in my mind that somebody who's determined to identify a pseudonymous email participant could, take it with a court order to one remailer after another internationally and ultimately decrypt it. And so what we did instead was made a next version, which is basically a large POP server, like a mail server, that you would connect to using the more real-time Tor-like network. And then you would fetch from that while being anonymous. So sort of basically using a POP server over Tor as a way to receive pseudonymous email. Now to discover somebody's email, you have to do these kind of, global passive adversary kind of attacks, which I think are harder. And there was a concept called forward anonymity in the network, which is something that I had observed around this time. I think Tor makes use of it or discusses it. So there's the concept of forward secrecy, which means that if somebody records your encrypted SSL session or something, they can't come to you afterwards and demand you to decrypt it because the protocol uses temporary keys and you don't have them after, within seconds after the connection is closed, after you close the browser tab or something. And so forward anonymity is the same concept but applied to anonymity, that if somebody would come to a Tor server or an anonymous email server after the fact with some recorded encrypted information that was exchanged for an email or web browsing and ask them to decrypt it, they shouldn't be able to. And so by doing it with this kind of more real-time access to a POP server, we got, I think, a bit better on that forward anonymity criteria.
Yeah, so just maybe for the audience to kind of understand forward security a bit, the one way to think about it is the difference between PGP and say Signal, where in PGP, if I give you my key and I got my private key, you got my public key, and vice versa, we can send these wonderful encrypted messages. But if someone steals my laptop and gets my key, they can then decrypt all my messages. But that's not the case necessarily with, let's say, Signal. Because each message generates a new, as Adam put it, temporary key. And then that temporary key, the next message, when I send you a reply, generates a new temporary key. So this is kind of what you most call a ratchet, I think is the term that Signal uses for these keys. And what's really interesting, I did not know that Freedom had this concept of forward anonymity. I actually saw that you had worked, Adam, on forward secrecy at TLS and PGP as well. I have to sit down and think about forward anonymity because we at NIM are dealing with the same problem. It's not an easy problem to solve. So let's say, again, I want to send an anonymous email. And one of the reasons why anonymous emails never took off, and this is, I've had quite a few discussions with Ian Goldberg over this, is that, you couldn't respond to anyone. So it was great for, I don't know, let's say I want to deliver something that I don't want to be connected to me ever. Like, let's say I want to deliver, like, I don't know. There's a famous case of a crazy guy using Tor to deliver a bomb threat. And but for most people, they want to respond. So let's say I'm Snowden, I'm leaking the NSA documents. I want to establish contact with a journalist like Glenn Greenwald, but that journalist I want to establish that contact anonymously, but that journalist somehow has to email me back without my real identity being revealed, and not my IP address to email either, because if you're Snowden, it's not just your real name that you don't want to leak; it's where you are. For example, you could be hiding in Hong Kong, and that's a really hard problem. Anyone who's seen the kind of hilarious clips of Snowden trying to give instructions to Glenn Greenwald about how to use PGP and what a total disaster that was, it's super hard. And so and at NIM, we're taking off from a concept that's actually maybe not for anonymous, and it has, I think, some of the same problems that Adam identified. So I need to think about this a bit more. But we're using a descendant of a design that came after Mixmaster. So Lynn Sassman built Mixmaster, the kind of original, at least maybe correct me if I'm wrong, Adam, I think that was the first Mixnet implementation, at least that I've been able to track down. I mean, Chaumian invented it, but I don't think he implemented it ever. And the first Mixnet that I saw was Lynn and Lance's Mixmaster anonymous email remailer for the Cypherpunks to replace whatever the Finnish guy's software was. And then, but it didn't have replies. So then George Denises and the two developers of Tor, Roger and Nick, they built Mixminion. And Mixminion, again, it's exactly what Adam said. It had this thing called a single-use reply block built in. So this is like I send you a message, and as part of the message I send you, there's a little kind of a key, let's say, attached to the message, and a bit of encrypted data. And that encrypted data has the path back to another Mix node in the Mix network. So this is, for example, a little bit like a hidden service. It's a path right back to hidden service, and I drop my message off there. But so I want to respond to you. So you send me a message. You say, "Hey, I'm Snowden. I want to leak these NSA docs." Glenn's like, "Great. I will publish these NSA docs." I look at that single-use reply block. That doesn't tell me Snowden's email, doesn't have his IP address, doesn't tell me anything about him. It just gives me the address of another node in this mixed network, this anonymous network. I send that message back to Snowden, and and it just dropped off a mixed node. It's like a Dropbox, and then Snowden would at some point later retrieve that message. And that's actually what NIM is working on now. But the problem with that approach is exactly what Adam points out, which is that, an adversary that's very powerful could just, kind of watch all the traffic and probably figure out, let's say I drop something off in a mix node, not many people are using the Mixnet, and I can just, some guy goes to get that message. That guy's probably Snowden. I can look at the traffic and figure that out. And that's really dangerous. We've actually been looking at NIM. This is very much in research mode now. We're looking at what's called private information retrieval as a possible method of solving this problem, where essentially you don't just have one Dropbox, you have 20. And so it's very hard for the adversary to watch all of it. And maybe you spread your reply among many different Dropboxes. And that's how we were thinking about it. I have to sit back and think about this forward anonymity issue. But I do want to go back to zero knowledge systems. So one of the issues that Tor, like you said, Tor is a little bit more peer-to-peer than zero knowledge because, with the Freedom Network, the Freedom Network itself as a company was running all of these nodes, or at least some portion of them. And obviously, Freedom zero knowledge systems could be attacked, and that could be used to attack the Freedom Network.
Well,
Tor doesn't have that
yeah, I
problem
mean
as much.
the answer to the zero knowledge systems running it is that they contracted with various ISPs to run them, so that they wouldn't have enough control to like eavesdrop on the whole network.
And just a quick question: is it true that Mixmaster was the first Mixnet that you saw implemented, or were there ones before that?
I mean, I think it was the first that got any significant real world use anyway. I mean, there was like PGP remailers, which was like basically Pennet 5-style remailers, but with PGP encryption that Halpin built, but it didn't break the email messages up into fixed size chunks. So if somebody could observe, they could just figure out what's what by the size of their message, kind of thing.
And actually, I'd like to talk about the size of the message issue. So so one of the interesting things that you have to think about when you're thinking about traffic analysis is, obviously with Bitcoin, the Bitcoin transactions are all sort of the same size. This is great. But what if I'm using the same anonymous remailer to send Bitcoin transactions, and let's say I'm sending a large file? So this is something, obviously the large file is a very different traffic signature. It looks as a lot more packets in the Bitcoin transaction. And how can we hide these two types of traffic together? That's a really hard problem. And I remember correctly, I was trying to look in the history. I think the first concept of using mixnets and payments was actually not for email, and it wasn't for digital cash. I think it was actually file storage. I think it was, correct me if I'm wrong, because you know this better than me, Adam. I think it was Ross Anderson's what was called the Eternity Service in 1997, which I think you coded up. I don't think Ross tried to code it up. Was originally
Yeah,
envisioned as sort of anonymous, decentralized file storage.
yeah. I mean, his design was a bit more elaborate than what I built, but I was like impatient and I wanted to build something simple that I could deploy. So I kind of made a simplified alternative and used the same name. But yeah, basically the way I did it was to use Usenet as a broadcast service and sort of storage system. So subscribers who wanted to run caches of it would keep the encrypted content messages that would get broadcast, and then they would run like a local proxy that would decrypt them and serve them as web pages. And so the point was you would be browsing, you receive all the traffic in this encrypted dark web kind of space. And if you had the URL would have encryption keys baked into it, and you could decrypt them, or there could be a password. So it's all based on PGP and broadcast. But Ross Anderson's approach was more sophisticated and complicated. So yeah, I expect he had some mixnet concepts in there, but the full design was never implemented.
Yeah, because I was reading the paper and he's like, "Oh yeah, don't worry, we'll just use a mixnet and we'll just have some digital cash that will just magically work." And I was like, "Wow, those are very hard problems to solve."
Yeah.
So he kind of assumed he kind of assumed Bitcoin existed and there was a working mixnet, and then somehow he put a file storage system on top of it.
Yeah. I mean, there's another interesting connection between Bitcoin and things like Mixmaster, PipeNet, and Tor, which is, at this time, like early 90s to 2000s, the cypherpunks were thinking that, privacy tech was cool. We needed more privacy, freedom of association, and so on online. But that for this to work well, you would need anonymous electronic cash so that you could have quality of service and pay for it and scale it. And so, as well as the so just to pay for the infrastructure itself, right? To self-fund the infrastructure. And of course, as well, that the ability to buy things anonymously, like a PDF report or consulting services pseudonymously on the internet and so forth, was interesting as well. Yeah, so there was a kind of connection. So people were interested in Tor and remailers, but also electronic cash. And so that's kind of cool that Bitcoin, well, very cool that Bitcoin realized that aspect of it, of the picture.
Yeah, and I just want to make it clear, like I am very much into anonymous transactions and privacy, but I think the value of Bitcoin comes from digital scarcity and transparency. So, the reason why, fiat is the true master shitcoin is because there is no transparency into what the Fed is doing. We hear rumors, there's interest rates hiking, and rumor, they just can print as much money as possible. And I think, the great thing about Bitcoin is that it's transparent, that you know exactly how much Bitcoin you have and that you can kind of log to make sure the whole system does preserve that digital scarcity. So on that level, I don't
Right.
see anything. I think Bitcoin is, as I think you point out once, Adam, is I think it's pretty close to an optimal design. Now, the only thing that I think Bitcoin could use a bit, which we're now getting with Schnorr and Taproot, but I do want to ask a bit about the history of this, is I do think it'd be nice to be able to, and I think Liquid is basically the right designer, say, well, do we have some sort of side chain that can take Bitcoin in and make it private via confidential transactions or blinded addresses? And a lot of this conceptual work, I think, comes also from the cypherpunks, all of the kind of Chaumian, Chaum's original Chaumian eCash, which he tried to implement and failed with DigiCash. and I think a lot of the issues with that is because all the, including newer systems like GNU Towler that basically kind of revisit these Chaumian eCache systems that use essentially some sort of blinded signature for the cache and to maintain the audit books. These systems are all basically centralized. But what I've seen is that I would like to hear a bit about how Chaumian eCache was thought of by the cypherpunks, but also now it looks like Blockstream is bringing it back with mini mint support, which is I think a federated Chaumian eCache mint. Could you maybe talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I mean, the interesting thing, I mean, the Chaumian eCache approach, and there are a whole range of protocols, including one by Stefan Brands, which is more modern and better than the original Chaum protocol. Those systems have very nice, like, full anonymity and privacy and very strong guarantees, but they have two problems. One is they're centralized, and the second problem is they're unauditable. So you have to trust this centralized party. It's just the academic cryptographers looking at them didn't spot the problem because it was an assumption, and people like take assumptions as read after a while. That's just the way it works, and so they live with it and assume that's natural. And Bitcoin solved a problem that they weren't cognizant of. But the fact that it's not auditable seems to be fairly inherently baked into the fact that the server is basically blind signing something, so you don't really have a way to check that it didn't create those coins from nothing by itself. Nevertheless, the privacy problem is pretty interesting. So it's an interesting trade-off, and one way to sort of improve its trustability is to make it into a threshold so that, let's say there are a dozen servers and 9 of them have to sign. Now, 9 of them have to collude to create money without backing. And so that's a step forwards. And then the concept with the mini-min is that you would pay into it and get coins in exchange for Bitcoin or Lightning Bitcoin. And that would be held in escrow in a multisig by those nodes and could be paid out. So you're sort of trusting the server still, but at least the server has multiple participants that have to collude to take the funds, basically, or to create more funds in like blind format than exist in the underlying Bitcoin.
So
Yeah, go ahead.
So just to make sure I get it, so I'm sending you, let's say I'm basically sending these set of federated servers some Bitcoin. They hold it in escrow in like a multi-sig, and then you can do the kind of Chaumian eCache game inside. It's actually all the transactions are anonymous, and everyone can escrow out. Is that sort of?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of similar to Liquid actually in terms of how the peg works on Liquid. So with Liquid, it's 11 of 15, and we recently did an upgrade, which is a major upgrade for being able to dynamically change the membership and the size. But basically, in Liquid, the funds are held in 11 of 15 sort of hardware enforced peg-in protocol, and to take the funds, there would have to be large scale collusion, and the people doing it would have to compromise their hardware, which is tamper resistant. So that's the kind of attempt to sort of harden it or increase the security of that arrangement. But essentially, you do a peg in, and there's an automated process where you get liquid Bitcoin out of it. You use that with confidential transactions on the network, and eventually the current bearer holder can ask to peg it out, and that goes through one of the service providers, and you get back your Bitcoin. And so there's a similar concept going on with Minimint, which is that there's some similar kind of set of servers that you peg into, and you get kind of federated or threshold Chaum. It's not actually Chaum, but something Chaum-like in effect, like blind eCache, and then you can use that. The difference is you can see how much Bitcoin is pegged in, but you can't see and audit real time how much has been issued in a blind format, and that's quite hard to do. But that also, that has benefits too, right? So it's a kind of side effect, like the unauditability is a side effect, but it is quite scalable and extremely private. So it's just another layer 2 trade-off, which can be pretty interesting for Bitcoin users for the appropriate use cases.
Yeah, I mean, I think it really, I mean, it sounds good to me because I think you get some of the benefits of Bitcoin, the digital scarcity and the real value and the transparency. But you could also, when you need to use it for a private transaction, you have a way to use it while preserving that value. And I think that would have addressed, I mean, I know I was friends with Len Sassaman, unfortunately, before he died, the guy behind Mixmaster, or one of them. And, he always was a little bit unhappy with the lack of privacy in Bitcoin. I think so. Minimin and Liquid, I think, do really excellent jobs addressing those in a way which maintains sort of core principles of value. Now, I think another question is, so this technology, we're also working on it with NIM, but we're doing it in a slightly different way. We're going back. So you mentioned, Adam, there's this guy called Stefan Bronze, who basically took some of Chaum's digital cash concepts. He said, well, is there a way I can use this in a more general purpose? So is there a way I can, for example, use it not just to prove I have a certain amount of money, but let's say to prove I'm an American, or to prove I'm British, or to prove I'm over 18, or the use case which has been driving me absolutely crazy because I'm in Europe. I feel like every day, even to go outside, I have to go to a restaurant. They ask for this COVID passport. They want my ID card. This is all, to me, giant violations of privacy. And I said, well, even if you really want to do this, these techniques are total bullshit, because in reality, we have ways to prove things anonymously by kind of these kind of generalizations of Chaumian eCash. I know you coded up, I think, one of the first open source implementations. I guess Bronze was probably closed source, Credlib, and we've taken some of those concepts and moved them in a general purpose direction as well. Because what we're trying to do at NIM, one of the problems the HashCash solves is the problem of DDoSing. So we're trying to use these kinds of anonymous credentials to prevent essentially giant DDoS attacks on our Mixnet.
Yeah.
But I think they are really kind of cool general purpose technology from the cypherpunks that a lot of people have forgotten about. I don't know if you have any feelings on anonymous credentials or history with Credlib and all of this work, because it's another fascinating strain of cypherpunk work.
Yeah, I mean, Stefan Brands was actually originally David Chaum's PhD student, but he finished his PhD with different advisors. And Chaum's eCash system was using the RSA crypto system and blinding in that space. And at the time that Stefan started, it was considered to be impossible to do blinding with DSA and or discrete logs. And Stefan proved that wasn't the case by making us actually more efficient and flexible system that seemed to gain advantage from using discrete logs. So that was a kind of leap forward in the technology. And one of the limitations of the basic Chaum scheme is that there was no denomination for a coin. So if you wanted different denomination coins, you had to have like different public keys for each coin, and then you'd get a privacy leak because somebody could look at the denominations that were being spent. Now that much would be obvious. And so if you had a unique amount, you'd lose privacy. Whereas Brand's version, the coins could have an arbitrary value, and you could make change. And so it was more flexible from that point of view. So that became kind of one attribute of it. And actually, in that format, you have what is compatible with the Pedersen commitments. So it's actually very similar cryptography to what are used in confidential transactions, but it's more general, so it can generalize to multiple attributes. So you can have a coin with a value and another attribute, which is a type, let's say a currency. This is euros, this is dollars, this is Bitcoin. And then you can have more attributes like, about a person, I'm eligible for this, or so on. And it has a kind of simplified Boolean circuit proving system where you can prove basically logical statements about involving your attributes without revealing the attributes, like I'm over 18 and I live in this country, or I don't live in this country, or my balance is under this. You can prove all kinds of weird things involving your eligibility for something without revealing the specific inputs that make you eligible. So that's kind of fun.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that anonymous credentials, I mean, you see in Ethereum all these really bad concepts, like people, I want to put my identity on the blockchain, or even sometimes with Bitcoin with the DID technologies I'm not a huge fan of. I used to work at W3C, and I think, we do have from the cypherpunks ways to do generalized identity in a way which is essentially privacy preserving, which discloses and selectively discloses only what we need to disclose. And the technology that we're seeing now deployed in Mini-Mint, some of the stuff that NIM is working on with anonymous credentials, all of this stuff goes back to Adam's early work and Stefan Brand's and Chaum's early work. I think this work can help you address a lot of these problems that we have in a way which is a little bit more effective. Because I think one of the things, at least for me, I want my information that's personal, my personal data, my age, my address, my name. I feel like that should all be private by default. And the account-based model of Ethereum, just putting shoving all that in there, trying to shove it on top of Bitcoin in some crazy way, doesn't really make sense. The UTXO model is better, but it's also important to say that the reason why Bitcoin is transparent is because you want to preserve this digital scarcity. But when you're in other use cases, like I don't know, proving that I can cross this border or whatever, or that I have, for example, in NIM, access to this mix that I can make 2 gigabytes of traffic anonymous. I think these kinds of use cases, anonymous credentials are better at. And it's one of these weird bits of work. So the thing which is kind of amazing about the cypherpunks is that and Adam is one of the pioneers here, but there's many other pioneers that a lot of them are gone, like Lynn Sassman and Hal Finney, and a few are still with us. Ian Goldberg is doing wonderful work as a professor over at University of Waterloo. But regardless, I mean, there's all this other kind of technology that I think we should develop. And I think one thing that we've been looking at, and the problem that privacy enhancing technologies has historically had, is that it's really it's not in the best interest of nation states to see people use them, at least at least intelligence agencies, let's say. And so historically, you've seen things like Tor take off with a mixture of government grants and volunteers running nodes. And I think that has actually worked remarkably well. If you look at Tor, it's got like 2 to 6 million active users, depending on how you count them. It's hard to count, of course. It's a privacy preserving system, but you're still seeing like there is demand, and you're seeing, if we can ignore the fact that mobile coin is a weird SGX Monero ripoff, just ignore the fact that they have a payment system. We look at Signal as just a messaging app. Messaging, privacy against messaging, there's a demand. You're seeing Signal grow in comparison to, say, WhatsApp. And I would like to have the Bitcoin community look at some of these other cypherpunk technologies in more detail and figure out how we can essentially enable people not just to have transparent and valuable digital cash, but how we can actually also keep our identities private. Because one of the problems is if your identity is completely public and you're someone that has a lot of Bitcoin, you could be a target, and you may be doing something you think is completely legal now, but there's no guarantee it will be considered legal in the future, or that even laws will be respected in the future, right? So you could go to, say, I don't know, Russia and get kidnapped by at a Bitcoin conference. I've heard rumors that these sort of things are possible, and so I do want people to kind of take this privacy enhancing technology seriously, and I do think Bitcoin gives us the chance to kind of both experiment these technologies by looking at this very clear use case. How can I make my Bitcoin transaction private? How can I defend that peer-to-peer transaction? How can I make sure my connection to the full node is private? I would love to see Lightning evolve to something where there's like a knob where I can say, I want my Lightning transaction to be fast and transparent, or I want my Lightning transaction to be slow and not transparent. And Lightning uses a lot of the same technology, like Sphinx packets that were used by Mixmaster, Mixminion, sorry, not Mixmaster, Mixminion, the anonymous email remailer from the cypherpunks, and Mixnets like NIM. We use the same packet format, so I think there's some possibility for growth there. And now you're seeing with Mini-Mint a kind of revival in a Bitcoin-centric way of Chaumian and eCash and the privacy properties there. Haven't seen anything really big on anonymous credentials, but hopefully that's always kind of one step away from Chaumian and eCash. So hopefully that stuff all eventually works out as well.
My fellow plebs, the Bitcoin conference is back. Bitcoin 2022, April 6th through the 9th, is the ultimate pilgrimage for the Bitcoin ecosystem. The Bitcoin Conference is the biggest event in all of Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies. We're leveling up and making this bigger and better than ever. I'm talking straight to the moon with the 4-day-long festival in the heart of Miami at the Miami Beach Convention Center. This has something for everyone. Whether you're a high-powered Bitcoin entrepreneur, a core developer, or a Bitcoin newbie, Bitcoin 2022 is the ultimate place for you to be with your people and celebrate and learn about the Bitcoin culture. So make sure to go to b.tc/conference to lock in your official tickets and use promo code Satoshi for 10% off. You want more off? Pay in Bitcoin and you'll receive $100 off general admission and $1,000 off whale pass. Those are stackable. So go to b.tc/conference and attend the best conference in Bitcoin history. Yo, my fellow Bitcoin lovers, have I got something specifically curated for you? The Deep Dive is Bitcoin Magazine's premium markets intelligence newsletter. This isn't some paid group shilling buy and sell signals. No, this is a premium Bitcoin analysis led by Dylan LeClaire and his team of analysts. They break down in an easily digestible way what is happening on chain, in the derivatives markets, and in the greater macro backdrop context for Bitcoin. This newsletter turns volatility into a joke. So hit up members.bitcoin.magazine.com and use promo code podcast for 30% off the deep dive. That's members.bitcoinmagazine.com, promo code podcast for 30% off. Divorce your pay group and learn why Bitcoin is the strongest asset by Dylan and LeClaire and his team.
I do think maybe it would be good to get questions from the audience about all of this stuff. I know that was probably a lot of material very quickly, some of it very
Yeah, I was
complex.
about to ask that. I know we have a lot of very esteemed Bitcoiners in the audience. If you'd like to come up and be a part of the conversation, please raise your hand. I will definitely be doing some very strong betting. So, yeah, I don't want any like random conversation or anything like that. So, if you think that I'm ignoring you and you should be on stage, send me a DM. But yeah, if you're in the audience, again, I see a lot of developers, privacy experts would love to invite you to join the conversation. But I mean, Adam, I don't know, while we're waiting for folks to kind of request to come up, do you want to kind of respond to Harry and the ideas that he just shared?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the credential concept is interesting because it can, get away from the dossier effect where there's a central service that is, archiving and logging everything for later analysis, and turn it on its head to be, well, this is the information I choose to disclose, and it proves only what you need to know to provide me service. So I think that's a step forward, and that's something that Zero Knowledge was trying to do, in fact, but it was kind of pre-Snowden, the demand for this, for Tor, anonymous privacy was much lower. I think post-Snowden, there are a lot more people interested in using VPNs. I think Bitcoin and cryptocurrency has created, another demand and reason to care about privacy and network security, which is you can get robbed or, network attacked if you're careless about your location, your IP address, and transactions you're sending. So I think it's it's an interesting time for building privacy networking technology for general internet use, in addition to like Bitcoin and crypto related use cases.
Thank you. Lola, welcome to the stage. Shinobi, welcome to the stage. I guess feel free to jump into the conversation. Welcome, Austin Hill.
Sure,
Go for it,
thanks.
Shinobi. Oh, yeah, Lola, go for it.
Yeah, I have two questions actually. So, first of all, I'm a huge fan of the cuts and posts protocol, which I think is what NIM was originally based on. So, I'm a pretty big fan of NIM as well. I have two questions though. The first question is from, if I understood it correctly, right now you are paying out node operators or rewarding them in Bitcoin. And from what I've heard is that the plan is to have your own token. So I just wanted to know, or maybe you already have your own token, if you have some updates on that. And the second is if you could comment on taking investments from Andreessen Horowitz, who I think we all know are sometimes classified as friends of the NSA, with their involvement in undermining the encryption of voice over IP with the purchase of Skype, who shortly after were launched in the Prism project. So yeah, I just wanted to see if you have any comments on that.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, we do use a reputation token that was on Liquid and currently where it's on WebAssembly. We do not, again, we are by the book. We have a prospectus. We do not want that token used as payment. So it's important to remember that when you could just say, and I think this is a reasonable criticism, why can't NIM just use a sort of Bitcoin bond? And the argument there is essentially, you could imagine a version of NIM, and maybe someone will build it, that uses a reputation purely in form Bitcoin. But because we're trying to essentially balance the demand for bandwidth with the ability of nodes to mix traffic, we essentially did decide to go with our own reputation token. The concept of reputation tokens in Mixnets is very old, predates Bitcoin. Tor used to be a for-profit company that failed called Reputation Technologies. And so, we're okay with that. That being said, we don't want anyone to ever use any kind of NIM reputation token as a means of payment. For that, you should use Bitcoin. People should pay for it in Bitcoin. They should be paid out in Bitcoin. And furthermore, it's very important people do not invest in NIM as a token or in anything as a token as an investment contract. So that's security. All right. So securities, there are ways to do debt securities and stuff. Bitcoin mining notes are one way, which is a good way. But that being said, that is actually just not what people should do. It's if you want to invest in something, you should invest in, well, obviously Bitcoin. That's the only cryptocurrency I hold, at least. So I just want to be clear that there's a little distinguishment between using a reputation token to track reputation and a general purpose means of payment, of which I think Bitcoin is really the only design that holds water. In terms of Andreessen, yeah, I mean, I don't know about Andreessen and Skype. I'll have to look into that. In terms of funding, if someone had just stopped by and given us a giant amount of Bitcoin, we would not have had to take venture capital funding. But we did take venture capital funding. We've taken venture capital funding since the beginning because we are a venture which plans to become successful. And as as an academic, there's multiple levels of hell in venture capital, and I've done a lot of different kinds of funding. The original work from Katzenpost and NIM was all funded by the European Commission, who didn't ask for any backdoors. You can look at the code if you don't believe me. And the original work from Tor was funded by the Naval Research Lab. So you have direct government nonprofit funding. And then if you don't want to go down that path, then you have venture funding. And there's a different options there. So for example, I used to work at MIT. And at MIT, I was like, man, we really should build a Mixnet, commercialize it. And I talked to some people at MIT, and they said, well, have you talked to In-Q-Tel? In-Q-Tel is actually the venture arm of the CIA. So they exist, they're a venture fund, and they build tech for the CIA. And of course, and to my knowledge, the US government, there's a project called Racer, is indeed building a Mixnet. They're building their own Mixnet because Tor doesn't work too well in China. And so it's called, I forget what Racer stands for, but essentially it's a DARPA project to build a Mixnet, the world's probably slowest Mixnet, in order to kind of get through the Great Firewall of China. So, when we looked at the space of funding, we thought Andreessen was interesting insofar as that they actually had a lot of experience in something that I personally don't have a lot of experience in, which is running a company. So they haven't asked us anything about security and privacy. We did get, I think, the funding because we were supported by Dan Bonnet, who's working on DC nets. That's sort of like PipeNets. And Dan Bonnet knows us from the crypto elliptic curve wars, at least, and my previous work in W3C. So I think Dan pushed us into A16. And Dan Bonnet, I mean, I think he's a pretty good guy. And his crypto Coursera course is definitely something everyone should take. And then, to be honest, Andreessen's been pretty good to us insofar as that when we have a problem around HR or we have a problem with legal, we have a problem with looking at like debt securities or something, I have an army of lawyers and an army of people with experience in startups I can lean on and call. And I'm happy. I'll clarify this all in a blog post. Now, that being said, there is some very bad behavior. So I think Andreessen's great in terms of if you haven't had a start before, and they provide a lot of training, and that's been a lot for me to learn. But where they're not good is, I think, you want to be very careful around, I think, the Web3 meme. I'm not as much as a Bitcoin purist to say probably Adam or Jack. I think there are interesting technologies on anonymous file storage stuff that could be built. But I think what you really want to be careful of is just like disguising NFTs and other, sort of crap projects with some sort of weird branding. And they use this as an excuse to essentially do various forms of, kind of dumping on retail and all sorts of chicanery. And I do think Andreessen, definitely has been attacked for doing that. I think the question is, have they done it? And I probably, but I don't have any concrete evidence, at least from the people we talk to. Andreessen has actually seen a number of companies through development. I think Adam's had similar experiences with Mosaic and other folks. And we would have, I do think that it's like, it is a hard trade-off. Do you want to run this as a commercial company like NIM or Zero Knowledge Systems? Or do you want to run this as a nonprofit project like Tor? Or do you want to run this, and then you got to kind of choose, who to work with. And, I decided to go the commercial route and chose to work with people that I thought could actually help us commercialize. I think reasonable people can make different choices. I mean, I do think, Blockstream at some point had some similar choices. Well, I forget exactly who ended up funding Blockstream, but generally, the whole venture world is unfortunately quite small. And I'm sure there's bad behavior, but there's also things you can learn. And honestly, like, we tried for years to work all this stuff in a pure nonprofit space, and you just can't attract good talent. Like, one thing that Blockstream does, and which NIM is trying to do, is you can attract talent, you can keep it. That's what pumps the code out. That's what gets things working. And to do that, you have to offer people, I don't know, real salaries, basically. And pure volunteer projects come and go, but the real problem is not the moment of creation. The real problem is the maturation, the maintenance. And this is where I think for-profit structures are I think, much superior. In other words, startups deliver code, and it's very exceptional to start the nonprofits that deliver code.
Awesome. Thanks for clarifying.
If it's any consolation, I definitely pressed Harry a decent amount regarding at least understanding the reputation token, at the beginning of, just meeting him and learning about NIM, but seems to check out. Austin Hill, Daniel, welcome to the stage. How's it going, Austin? You've been on stage a little bit longer. Would love to have you join the conversation.
Yeah, thank you. Glad to see this conversation occurring, and just maybe comment a little bit. Obviously, Harry was talking about some of the work from brands, and Adam obviously spoke very credibly because he coded CredLib. But I was happy to hear kind of some of this work is reemerging and getting some attention, because I agree with Harry's comment. There's a whole suite of cypherpunk technologies that go well beyond, that were really freedom enabling tech. Some of the work that Alex Gladstein at, HRF talks about, there's a whole suite of issues on the internet related to privacy, identity, surveillance capitalism, that in and of itself, even though I think a lot of us have really bought into Bitcoin and see Bitcoin as freedom enabling technology, that especially around financial sovereignty and being able to own your own money and move power to the individual from the state, but that in and of itself is not all of the solutions needed. And a lot of the solutions that were contemplated around shifting from an identity-centric world to one that includes NIMS and reputation capital requires a robust infrastructure. It's not just the cryptography. One of the problems we had at Zero Knowledge was how to bootstrap those systems. And what's kind of exciting in today's world, I think, is there are opportunities, whether it be like very large-scale systems that have large communities, whether that be Twitter, Reddit, or other ones that have yet to be invented. Social gaming, Discord, a whole bunch of other services that could start to move to federated pseudonymous identities where the reputation and credential stuff of brands could actually solve a large problem. Because one of the problems you have in any NIM-based identity system is the idea of throwaway identities, identity pollution space where people just have sock puppets. And when you start to establish kind of blended identity credentials where you have credentials like it is a person or some sort of financial cost to a NIM, you're able to build a richer investment in persistent pseudonymity where you can deal with some of the iterated prisoner's dilemma of if the cost of a NIM is zero, where the cost of spinning up a NIM is zero, then it's very, very easy to just have massive amounts of them. And we see what happens in like Reddit and other communities when you have a zero cost of identity or a zero cost of establishing a new one. But if you can do much more rich identity credentialing systems that, as you mentioned, don't have to be linked to or can be linked to a richer set of identities that is never disclosed. So, and this allows you to present a credential that says, okay, I have the right to get a NIM in this community, but I don't want to throw away that NIM. I don't want to abuse that NIM, but I can use it without leaking or being tracked over many different uses. And that was one of the key benefits of Stefan Brands, that you could set up an identity credential NIM and not have it be linked to any of your other identities, but have it be blinded. And so I'm excited to hear more of this work is being done. I still think there's just loads of effort. And I was glad to hear you bring up Dr. Ian Goldberg, because some of the tech that comes out of University of Waterloo, both from tracking nation-state surveillance for some of the work they're doing aside from Tor, with, I think it's called, I'm trying to remember the name. They have a massive project that actually tracks nation-state surveillance, blocking nation-state censorship.
I think you're thinking Citizen Lab, maybe?
No, this was actually, I saw it at Tor. I'll find the name of it. But, there's obviously a lot of work at the root level of the internet where there are major vulnerabilities that distributed and Cypherpunk technologies, I think, could address, that right now we're moving away from. More and more we're seeing each nation state start talking about a private version of the internet that allows them, like in the Arab Spring, to turn off access to an entire country. We've seen it at Myanmar. And when it's not that, it's partnering with large surveillance capitalist companies like Facebook that provide the primary means of access by subsidizing internet. And that requires you to then give up your privacy. And so anything that we can do, and I think Bitcoin, the wealth that's being accumulated amongst liberty-minded people in Bitcoin, I hope finds its way back into angel investing, funding of some of these projects, and seeing a more robust Cypherpunk tool set. And I know, some of that work is being done by new startups, but I think we need a lot more of it that isn't, as you mentioned, tied to some weird tokenomics where you're trying to launch a token every time you're trying to fund new freedom technology.
Actually, Austin, you kind of touched on loosely like something I wanted to bring up. And, you mentioned earlier, Harry, like the idea of identities that have like zero correlation publicly between different interactions and things like that. Like that is a very good thing and a setup for a lot of use cases. But for some use cases, like I see a need for the exact opposite. Like my identity as Shinobi. Like I intentionally want that to be publicly indexed. I want everything at least public, like not private interactions with people that I do with this identity to be public and to be correlated, because that's the whole reason that I constructed this identity, is to build that public correlated reputation. And I just kind of wanted like your thoughts on like, why do you think there needs to be such like a binary line there? Like I can have this reputation with all of the public interactions I engage in, all correlated, all out in the open for people to see. And I can still use, blinded mechanisms to prove little things selectively without leaking things in private, or to engage in a private interaction that isn't necessarily correlated with all of my public actions. But for a large degree of what I want to do under this pseudonym and with this reputation, I want all of that out there so that people can actually see what I do, what I say, how I act, and actually, judge me for all of those things correlated together.
I would just comment that that's what the goal of some of these toolkits are, is it shouldn't be binary. It should be in your control. And in fact, you can, with some of the blinded credentials and other cypherpunk tech, be able to do more nuanced statements like that. So you could have, for instance, a reemergence of Web of Trust where you can say, okay, this is a pseudonym that actually has 40 or 50 accreditations by other pseudonyms or by known identities that say this is the unique Shinobi, without having to show everyone that's on your Web of Trust tree, or without having to reveal your true identity. And it actually adds credibility to your pseudonym when you can show more accreditations that don't necessarily have to reveal your true identity. And you can then reverse it and be totally pseudonymous, just showing I have a pseudonym that has 5 years of history and more than 50 people in this Web of Trust have asserted that I'm a real pseudonym. But in this use case, I just don't want to reveal the actual name. And so to give you control of that should be the goal.
Yeah, I mean, my point, I mean, I think it's more of like an implementation or deployment viewpoint. So the reason why I'm not, I'm hardline against identity systems that are used in things like COVID passports, just because I think it creates an infrastructure which, regardless of what you think about COVID, it will be abused. I mean, we have never existed in a world where we had to, the right to associate, the right to move into physical space should not, I believe, to public space, at least, be controlled by a kind of public or private computational infrastructure, because the right for abuse is, I think, is just too high. I mean, I say this as, I'm a political dissident. I had to deal with, undercover police for the last 10 years, tried to literally just fuck with me at airports. It's been going on for a long time, and and I have it very light. I can only imagine what it does to people who are really targeted. So I think, because I've seen these technologies be abused, so I'm very, perhaps overly worried, overly paranoid of that. But that leads to my preferred deployment path. So I'm not against. Look, if people like, I think transparency has a lot of value in terms of money. That's why Bitcoin has value. I think there are people who transparency in identity has a lot of value. For example, if I'm an influencer, I guess my identity is where my value comes from, my money. And maybe they want to link everything, or my reputation as a great coder on GitHub, I want that to link me to, I don't know, maybe I should get something else. I mean, in an ideal world, we wouldn't have to have startups, because people that made great code would somehow just get Bitcoin and prosper. That would be wonderful. And I'm happy to see Square and other folks push in that direction. I do want to say that, speaking of A16Z, I pitched NIM at Ev Williams and stuff with Chelsea Manning in 2017. And, you'd be surprised. It is incredibly hard. It's very hard to pitch privacy projects, even in the equity space right now. It's just very hard to pitch privacy projects in Silicon Valley and in general. And most of our early backers were almost entirely non-American. Now, what I would want to point out is that I think it's a deployment issue about identity. So if you want your identity to be, I think identity can be public, but I want that to be something that I can opt into. I don't want that to be something that's put upon me. I don't want FATF. I don't want a government. I don't want anyone saying I have to be public by default, because the problem with being public by default is that it's very hard to layer privacy on top of being public. Once information is leaked, it's always leaked. You never go back in time and de-leak that information. So I prefer systems that are based on anonymous credentials, which let you start out as anonymous and private and then leak, ideally in an unlinkable manner, as you need. Now, I do think there are cases where people need, public sovereign identities, and I hope those people use the appropriate technology stacks. I just don't want that technology stack to be a default for people like myself who don't want it. And I think, and that level, I think it's really parallel to COVID passports, where, I'm totally okay with people who want to prove that they've had whatever many vaccines to be able to prove that. I just don't think they should ever be mandatory because maybe I don't want to prove that, or maybe I don't, and I don't want to be discriminated against for not having to prove that. So I think it's it's very hard to go from like public by default to private, but it's pretty easy to go from private to public, and that's why I think you want to start with kind of robust zero knowledge systems, build on anonymous credentials, and then build to public systems like DIDs, rather than like kind of trying to slap the zero knowledge on at the end. But yeah, I mean, to each his own. I do hope it all works out for everyone. And we any kind of identity system which is not controlled by nation state is to some extent a step in the right direction.
Well, I mean, I think it's not about moving back and forth between the two. It's about just having both options available, like compatibly. Like there's no reason that you couldn't take something like the DID spec and just have a compatible ID or identity set up there that you don't index, like that never makes it into the blockchain. But having that standard format and you can actually have tooling out there that is a lot easier to make interoperable across the two. Like I could privately share that identity out of band and it would be workable with the tool suites out there built for interacting with DIDs that are publicly indexed. You know what I mean? It's just about like the compatibility. And
well, I'll give a quick example. So I mean, different people can think about it different ways, but one thing that we have done, NIM, is that we have worked with the European Commission to do what's called privacy impact assessments on this COVID passport stuff, where my verdict is y'all be thrown in the fire. And we told it the European Commission. They decided not to fund us after we told them that y'all be thrown in the fire. But regardless, it should be. And second, even when you try to do it in a privacy preserving manner, it's really hard. And so I think maybe you're just underestimating how hard it is to go from private to public. We think we agree that there should be both options, but like, let me just give you the example of one of the few real world use cases of anonymous credentials, which is the IRMA system, which is a blinded RSA anonymous e-credential built funded in a nonprofit manner, funded by the Dutch government. And it serves as the basis of the Dutch COVID passports. But there's a big problem. And you look at that design on paper, and you can sort of say, well, on paper, man, that looks pretty anonymous. Like, that's a great system. The Dutch have just solved the privacy problem for COVID passports. Hooray for the Netherlands. But one of the problems with that system, and it's the same time I see a lot of blockchain systems, is that they ignore what we started discussing about, the network traffic, the TCP/IP packets going back and forth. So in the initial Chaumian IRMA identity system used by Netherlands, you had this giant flaw, which is that every time you wanted to do something with an anonymous credential, you essentially had to talk to a big central server. Now, that central server didn't learn too much, but the very fact that you were talking to it revealed where you were and that you were somehow being forced to prove your COVID status. So the people in the Netherlands had to tear that part out in order to build some sort of offline COVID verification system. And so that's what I'm saying. The reason why I do agree we should have both options, but I want the people to start with the most privacy preserving thing. And privacy preserving, not just in terms of what's on chain or what's off chain, but again, that's where we start. Like, Lightning is not private. It's fast. It has somewhat better privacy by virtue of being off chain, but an attacker can look at the nodes and de-anonymize people. Likewise, the same thing with identity systems. I can look at when you're using it, if it has an online component, and that online component is talking to a blockchain, for example. Be that Bitcoin or be that whatever crazy thing the European Commission's trying to push out. And that's kind of dangerous. And that de-anonymize use, you can do all the magic zero knowledge proof tricks you want on chain, but if your peer-to-peer broadcast,
but that's kind of my point, though.
Clear, you're screwed.
Like, you don't have to index that ID on chain. Like, what I'm saying is, like, just the data format of, like, the identifier of that key pair can be kept completely.
Yeah, but what I'm talking about is just the very fact of talking to the chain, just like the
no, but that's my point, though, is you
that's
do
a problem.
That format without having to talk to the blockchain, without having to look up some remote index. And when you're just talking that key pair in isolation that just happens to be the same format as DIDs indexed on the blockchain, it's just an isolated key pair, and it's just passing those proofs around. and there is no need for that interaction that leaks that metadata querying some backend somewhere.
Yeah, just let's get.
I mean, maybe, but then
maybe we can get Chris
I would
on
question maybe you don't need a blockchain. So.
Yeah, no, let's get Chris on the details, right? So there's DIDs is just a data format. It's a PKI format, just like, there's a cert PK, there's a cert format, there's DNS zone files, right? They're all just formats of data. So the DID spec only sets forth a format of data to say, if you resolve an ID, which doesn't require going to a blockchain in many schemes, you get a document back that contains the public keys and if the person chooses routing endpoints, right? One of the most basic DID methods is called did key. And like its name, it's literally just a did that's composed of a public key. So it's self-resolving, right? It's in the sense that there is no like query. It's like literally a public key. So like if someone hands you a did : key type did, they're just handing you a public key. And if they can answer a challenge against that public key, they own it, right? They own the private key. Now there's systems like Ion, for instance, that we're working on and continuing to integrate in our work. Allow for both.
I mean, I think we could debate. I mean, my only point was there are probably many use cases where my understanding is what a lot of people want to do is they want to create a big PKI for identity. And maybe it's just the keys, and that's cool, and people are okay with that. But some people aren't okay with that, and there's ways to solve these problems without having a big PKI on the Bitcoin blockchain or another blockchain or just in a big database somewhere. And so I tend to, and I think this is maybe where Austin was going. I tend to, I try to avoid PKIs when not necessary, and that's kind of how I feel about identity. I don't want my identity tied to PKI either on chain or off chain. But I understand that there may be people that do, and those people can use the did stack and go with it. I would be where I kind of draw the line is where these sort of decisions get put into nation state level mandatory infrastructure. So, as a voluntary system, I mean, I may not like it, but I can't stop people from, for example, using Ethereum. I can't stop someone from wrapping whatever in Ethereum. I can't stop someone from I have this friend of mine who's really into universal basic income, which I think is one of the universal basic income to me requires a surveillance state. So I think it's one of the worst ideas humanly possible, but there are well-meaning people who I otherwise like, who otherwise seem technically bright, who somehow think it's a good idea. And for those people, they can go for it. But I think where I just draw the line, which is more of a political line than a technical line, is the use of any identity technologies in nation state level or mandatory infrastructures. That's where I kind of really.
So Harry,
really
can I agree with you? So I want to agree with you on that. So I'm a libertarian, so I'll definitely agree with you that I don't want the government mandating any of this stuff. The only point I'd really want to reiterate, and I got cut off from spaces, I'm sorry, is that DIDS is the spec that allows for completely private non-blockchain, non-PKI formulations. So like did key is literally just a public key. There's no like public exposure unless you, I guess, go and post your did key, public key publicly, which you don't have to do unless you want it to be. And that's fine, right? No blockchain, you just give someone a public key. Other methods, like I was saying, like Ion, allow for both. Like you can actually create these completely off system DIDs that have all the capabilities of like routing and stuff, but aren't indexed, aren't public. They're not published anywhere unless you wanted to do that at a future point. So there's all sorts of formulations with DIDs. So the only thing I disagree with is like putting them all in one big box and saying like, oh, don't use DIDs if you want like private or, things that aren't indexed or addressable, because you can just choose a DID method that doesn't do that. That is my only point. I agree with many of the other things you said.
I mean, I would say that I think there is a fundamental disagreement technically insofar as that, the question is, does a key identify you? And maybe you say, well, it can or it won't. But for me, one of the nice things, for example, about Lightning and NIM and Mixnets and a lot of anonymous credentials is that they are what's called cryptographically unlinkable. So I get some ciphertext, I re-randomize it. I'm doing a Lightning transaction every hop. I hope, at least, if it's implemented correctly. The Sphinx packet is being re-randomized, and that means it's bitwise unlinkable. Like the bits aren't the same that come into the node that came out the node. And anything where the bits are somehow consistent over time, that is an identifier, even if it's not meant to be one.
Sure, let me agree with you again.
And
I want to agree with you again.
The retrieval and the access to that identifier while not cryptographically linking information, it can leak information on the network level, and that's something we were discussing earlier. We had Tor, we had Freedom. It's still not a perfectly solved problem. It's a very hard problem. I actually talked to Whitfield Diffie about this once at Financial Crypto, and Whitfield Diffie told me, I asked Whitfield, I said, why did you guys just not think about, was David Chaum like the only one thinking about the metadata problem? Why weren't you thinking about it? And Whitfield Diffie said, the reason we did public key cryptography was because it was an easier problem to solve. The other problem seemed unsolvable. The problem of control, of disguising who's talking to who at any given moment. And this is, this guy was looking at this stuff in the 70s. So I do think, maybe I'm being too, how do you say, too harsh.
Let's just separate them though, because
like I do think that that people, it just reminds me of Bitcoin, where people tended to believe pseudonymous keys were somehow anonymous. Pseudonymous keys are a huge step forward above, away from, fully identified, let's say, KYC systems like the traditional banking system. And NIMs themselves, which led to mixnets and HashCash and all this multiple work, NIMs themselves are just actually, historically pseudonyms. And like you said, value can accrue to persistent pseudonyms. I think Shinobi said that. But that being said, I think we should have an option for absolute unlinkability. And I think it really is a deployment question, where it's like, if I felt we had a foundation of an anonymous credential or zero knowledge proof that's unlinkable, then we built stuff on top of it that would be stronger than trying to do the reverse, which is taking something which is fundamentally linkable, like a long-lived public key, and then building like somehow privacy on top. But whatever. On some level, the market decides this stuff more than anything else.
But I mean, like, Harry, the issue of like that metadata timing, unless you also solve the network communication problem, also exists for things like Chaumian tokens, because those have to be actually checked and reissued every time you use something like that. And if you look at things like Cash that Frank Braun was building, there's actually schemes where you can build Chaumian credentials out of public-private key pairs, so that in addition to the blinded signature from whoever is attesting to what, you can also have that extra control mechanism of requiring a signature from your own key, so that that credential is not redeemable without that extra step of you authorizing use of it.
Well, maybe to take this back to Bitcoin, I mean, so at NIM we're trying to go after the traffic analysis problem first, and then build things on top like anonymous credentials. But that's just not what happened with most systems. Most systems have just ignored anonymous communication channels and overlay networks completely. Now, it's interesting that sometimes that, I was always, when I looked at Bitcoin, I was always wondering why Bitcoin didn't kind of think about this stuff ahead of time. And it ends up, some of the Bitcoin devs did. I wonder if anyone's in the room or if Adam remembers any of this stuff. Where I think in the early days of Bitcoin, there was a concern that the peer-to-peer broadcast itself was corrupted. Was less corrupted than Tor. So they said, well, let's assume that Tor has a lot of corrupt exit nodes, which ends up, the Keck attack show that indeed this was the case. And so, the people who were involved in Bitcoin, they said, well, our goal is to make sure this transaction gets mined properly and gets into the blockchain. So therefore, we're not going to use Tor because we're worried that the exit nodes might, for example, kill the traffic. We're going to use a peer-to-peer broadcast. And so, yeah, the network traffic issues are hard. And, again, with Bitcoin, because the value of Bitcoin comes from the transparency, but there are lots of people that want to use it anonymously. So from an infrastructural standpoint, when I'm designing a digital cash system whose value is based on transparency, then a pure peer-to-peer broadcast makes perfect sense. But if I want to unlink it from the usage, from the the desk I'm using it from, then I think you want to de-link a light client from the full client, and that's maybe where things like Tor and mixnets come in really handy. Or, like, for example, in the case of Liquid, like the communication between the Liquid nodes is pretty sensitive, but maybe not the users of Liquid as much, because So I think there are, as I think Adam said back in his paper in 2001 with anonymous systems, it is a space of trade-offs. That being said, I think it's good to begin with a hard line on privacy and then build up from there, because once again, it's just this almost physical state of this physical fact that once you leak something, you can't unleak it. So we can have a principled disagreement on how to build these things. I do think we agree on at least some of the core values.
So you don't. So one question I have is, so you talk about unlinkable, schemes, right? So I worked with MSR on Spartan, which is a snark scheme. Definitely has the property of unlinkability. And just so folks know exactly what this is, typically if you're doing any kind of credential, and credentials aren't bad in the sense of like in the primitive sense, like, right? Credential is essentially just like some party says something about another party, right? And that's provable. And when you form these, typically you're going to go to some sort of issuer. It needn't be a government. I could issue a credential to Harry that says, I like Harry. Harry's a nice guy, right? It could be anything, any statement. And typically I'll go to whoever that issuing party is, and I'll say, okay, great. Like I'm going to prove to you maybe some cryptographic material. We're going to do some exchange. And then you're going to give me back this thing, this proof that I can then vend out to different parties, the same proof. And the bytes essentially change so that it's unlinkable, like Harry's talking about. Like it's just not the same bytes. They can't all correlate and compare notes and know that I'm like the same person, right, presenting this credential. And that's actually separate, right? And in many ways, it's different than a DID, right? So a DID is like if you wanted some relationship with someone so they could recognize you again. And that doesn't mean a public relationship. I could create a DID key with Harry, right? That he's the only one I ever speak over this key to, so he can know me in a sort of recurring fashion, but I never share it anywhere else, right? And then because I've established this linkage with Harry, he can issue me a credential that's a zero knowledge credential, and I can go use that. And it's not like I'm leaking the public key that Harry and I use for our relationship. So the only thing I want to underscore here is these are two roughly different cryptographic constructs. And it's not like you choose one or the other. You might use them in tandem or in combination. Is that fair to say, Harry?
Well, the way to think about an anonymous credential system is that it's so zero knowledge systems are kind of general purpose or can be encode, let's say, arbitrary programs, and that's not the case for anonymous credentials. They encode sort of arbitrary arrays, which most people here can think of as like JSON blobs. And I think the disagreement is you're saying, well, I want this key for our relationship. I'm like, hey, why don't we just share this zero knowledge proof and just do that? Why do I need this extra relationship key? And I think you have a set of use cases where that extra relationship and that needs a key, and that could be super useful. And you need to have the whole PKI thing in there for some reason or another. Well, I do think that people are underestimating the set of use cases where you can just have an actual anonymous credential, where essentially what I think is it's unlinkable. It's unlinkable because the actual bits are different at every show, and that doesn't have to involve necessarily a blockchain. There are cases where you might actually want to use Bitcoin's blockchain. I need to look at Minimint in more detail. For example, preventing double spending with anonymous credentials historically in Chaumian schemes relies on a central bank, or in Brand's a central company. I think Brand was a Microsoft, if I remember correctly, and that was, I think, part of Microsoft Passport at some point under Kim Cameron. Or the details escape me. I think that the question is, can we build anonymous credential schemes which are decentralized? And that's the hard question. That's what I think NIM is working on with Coconut. I think that's what Blockchain is working on with Minimint, where somehow it's anonymous but pegged in and pegged out to Bitcoin in a similar fashion to Liquid. But I do agree there could be use cases where maybe you need some public key. I would just say like you should always think about if you actually need that public key, because anything you put on the blockchain can be tracked.
So we're
And
not
that's
talking about
just part
just
of it, man. It's like how it works.
Hey, I
It's like,
want to jump in too. I'm kind of curious what Adam's take is on this conversation. I know there's been a lot of back and forth, and from there, I feel like we're getting close to time to wrap it up. So I apologize to cut off the back and forth, but I mean, Adam, I'm curious what your two cents are on this back and forth, and then from there, I think we can close it out.
Yeah, I mean, I think PKI is a hard problem, so it's worth avoiding. But there are situations where you are trying to do something anonymously, and then if you need to prove something, you want it to be unlinkably anonymous, and there are systems for doing that, which should be mentioned. Whereas if you are pseudonymous, like you've got an ongoing contracting relationship or a subscription or something with a site, then maybe you need a recurring relationship. And I mean, a subscription is an interesting one because, technically all they need to know is that you're a paid subscriber and your subscription hasn't expired, which doesn't need your uses to be correlatable and synonymously linkable. So I think this anonymous unlinkability concept is quite nice. And while brands' credentials are not, as a starting point, kind of anonymously unlinkable, they can be reissued. So you can take an existing credential and get a new one that is unlinkable without even revealing to the server, like the issuing server, what the credential details are. Just give me another one of these with the same attributes in it, and it will give it you. And then the trick is you only use it once. But there are protocols that do this that kind of have a reusable but a linkable credential, proving, subscription or something like that, where you don't have to create, we don't have to refresh them with the issuer. So there's different protocols. I think the thing that worried me actually more about identity and blockchain is that there are a lot of people who are used to working in a hierarchical world and working with PKI and certificate authorities who might mistake that and try to write a smart contract with identity in a blockchain. And that would seem like a bad direction to me. So I was generally concerned that people would look at it as they've got a hammer and this thing looks like a nail. So they'd start using or misusing identity as the principles, as a security concept, the principle, which is like the thing that you back up that is the primary reference point. And in the banking world, the principle is the identity, right? If you lose your login password for online banking, you go back with documents and affidavits and signatures and stuff, and they give you a new password. Whereas with Bitcoin, the key is the principal, and if you lose the key, sorry for your loss. So like back it up well. And so I like the latter because it's a new paradigm which takes identity out of the equation, so it makes everything bearer by default, and then you back it up. And if you want to prove anything, you just prove it bilaterally to whoever you need to work with, hopefully in an unlinkable, anonymous way.
I mean, real quick, Adam, to like kind of bring this back to identity. Like this is a whole point with like unlinkable credentials. Like, let's say you get a credential and you lose it. How do you reestablish that without some kind of consistent, isolated like key or something that you gave to the issuer of that to be able to go back to them and go, hey, I lost this, I need a new one. Like,
well, I mean, if you lost all your keys, right? Well, I mean, you could design a protocol which does that, but it implies that you haven't in fact lost all your keys, right? You've got a backup. So if you've got a backup, maybe you lose your online key, but not your offline. Give me a new certificate key. Okay, fine, it works. But generally, users are bad at backup and passwords and security, so they're probably going to lose it all. And then their only option is to re-enroll. However, it was they convinced the issuer to give them credential in the first place, they'll have to do it from scratch, I would say.
Well, I mean, but that's kind of like you're talking an anonymous credential. Like that's a non-deterministic piece of data. So like that's a literal piece of digital data you have to back up. But with Bitcoin, we have mnemonic seeds. We have all of these schemes that make public-private key pair storage and backup a lot simpler. So you could have something like an HD key scheme like that, where every time you get a credential from somewhere, you give them a separate like public key that's totally isolated from the rest and get that anonymous credential. And that way, if you lose that, like you can always go back to them and not have to start from zero. So like I absolutely think there's a lot of utility here for like ZK proof based credentials, like things that are unlinkable. But I think it's kind of short sighted to just say that because a public key
itself, if you use it everywhere, could be linked together. We should just throw that out in thinking about these types of schemes.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just that a lot of people learn about public key cryptography due to Bitcoin, and then they're very excited about it and they want to apply it everywhere. But actually, there's an old problem, and there are a lot more sophisticated privacy-preserving ways to do it, like, one-use keys, zero-knowledge proofs, and a key hierarchy where you can prove things. So the question is, will developers put the effort in to learn about these things and deploy them, or will they do the simplest thing possible to sell their altcoin, right? And a lot of altcoins have .alt and like their entire balance associated with their name that they're using on Twitter. Okay, that's a supremely bad idea, but you've got to overcome the social obstacle that's causing them to do that, right?
Yeah, I mean,
All
one of
right,
the other
y'all.
things.
Hey, sorry, Daniel. I want to give Harry one last word to close it out. He helped organize this session, and then we really gotta close this one out. I got a meeting in 6 minutes that I gotta prep for. So
I've got a meeting in 6 minutes too. I just want to thank Adam for his time. I know you're intensely busy. I think everyone, of course, knows Adam from Proof of Work, and Proof of Work is the foundation of Bitcoin. But I do think knowing the history of Mixmaster, the Cypherpunks, Mixnets, is both good for understanding how we got here today, and also there's a bunch of unexplored, as Austin put it, technology which really deserves revisiting at this moment. I just want to say, honestly, we're doing pretty good right now. Like we've built some amazing infrastructure as a community, but I think a wave of repression is probably coming. And I think now is the time to really double down and add privacy or build new privacy tech. And I hope if anyone is interested, just jump on in whatever way you see fit. And there's many different use cases, many different kinds of people. Respect to Daniel and everyone else who's doing one sort of thing and other people doing other sort of things like Shinobi or whatever. But we just really do need to build this tech now, because if things get harsh in the future, we won't have the time to build the technology, because we'll be too busy dealing with the repression.
amazing. Thanks so much, Harry. Thanks so much, Shinobi. Thanks so much, Adam. Thanks so much, Daniel, Lola, everyone who joined and helped add to the conversation. I would encourage everyone in the audience, go check out the Bitcoin conference. We're trying to bring Bitcoiners together to meet in Meet Space to discuss these ideas and lead the front lines of freedom. I think that Bitcoiners are truly on the front lines of freedom, and gathering together in Meet Space is a big part of moving that movement forward. So b.tc/conference, check it out. We have special pricing if you pay in Bitcoin, and if you use promo code Satoshi, you can save 10% off. Thanks again, Adam. Thanks again, Harry, and everyone else